And you can see the whole of that documentary, Transgender Kids Who Knows Best, tomorrow night on BBC Two at 9 o'clock. But joining us to take this a little bit further, it's a highly sensitive issue, is Sean Fay, a transgender journalist in Bristol. And I guess that goes to the heart of it, Sean. At what point do you think children are able to make up their own mind on something like this?
Well, I think the whole point about this kind of treatment or realisation is actually a lot of it. There's a lot of nonsense in the media at the moment about transgender children and about the kind of treatments that they go through. I mean, something like puberty blockers, for example, which was just discussed there in the clip, are in fact about delaying puberty and allowing children space and time when they've experienced such strong distress in early childhood at their gender role, to actually give them the time before a puberty, which they didn't ask for and they're struggling with already, takes over and essentially takes a lot of decisions out of their hand that have to be reversed painfully later.
Let me just bring in Ray Blanchard, who's just joining us now from Toronto. Good to have you, Ray. Ray's spent many years researching the factors that determine the development of sexual orientation. And would you go along with that, Ray? Say, actually, if you can take out that messy, awkward, complicated stage of puberty because a small child knows best already, wouldn't you choose to do that?
Well, in the first place, there's a few facts that have to be introduced here for background. Number one, every follow-up study has shown that the majority of children with gender identity issues do not end up transsexual. The majority end up with normal gender identity. Secondly, we have no diagnostic procedure or method that can reliably distinguish which children are going to go in a transsexual trajectory and which ones are going to end up with normal gender identity, even without intervention. And thirdly, I think people who are not enthusiastic about gender transition in very young children take the position that the first line of approach clinically should be helping the child accept his or her sex. If they can't do that, then by puberty, it's reasonable to consider puberty blockers. And so Sean, I'm okay with puberty blockers.
Sean, we heard
but only after a screening period.
Let me just bring in Sean again. We heard about a doctor who was fired in Canada for not being gender affirmative enough. In other words, for asking children to pause before making that kind of gender choice. Surely it's right for the medical profession to try and stop that in the first instance because it's irreversible.
Well, one thing I want to say is that actually the doctor in question wasn't fired purely because of his, ideology about children and gender. He was also fired because of a review by his peers, which actually found that his methodology was faulty, but also that his practice as a clinician was abusive. He was photographing children in various states of undress, and his peers couldn't find out any reason why. He was asking them very lurid sexual questions. And, I mean, I have to say
Sean,
that we have to be a little bit wary, Emily, of...
categorically untrue. Okay, and really, this needs to be stopped.
OK, we've heard from Ray that's categorically untrue. I don't want to go further down these allegations because he's not here to defend himself. But let us look at the wider question, which is essentially that this is something that cannot be reversed for a child. Isn't it eminently sensible in such a young science for clinical practitioners to pause?
Well, unfortunately, I mean, the problem is that when that pause occurs, it sounds very nice and it sounds very reasonable and rational. But these are real people at the heart of it. And unfortunately, one statistic that genuinely is true in this country is that 48% of trans teenagers, before they hit 18, attempt suicide. Let's not think about it, that's attempt.
Gosh.
And what you're condemning to, when you call for this very reasonable pause, is for people who know, and their parents increasingly know, and their teachers increasingly know, and the majority of clinicians know. You're asking them to go through a process that's going to increase their mental distress.
Ray Blanchard, sorry, bring in.
The objective data show that the rates of suicidal ideation and gestures in gender dysphoric children are the same as the rates of those gestures and ideation in other psychiatric populations of children and adolescents. And furthermore, there is no data that the rate of completed suicides is higher in gender dysphoric children and adolescents.
If we just break this down, though, Ray, isn't the question that parents do not want to feel that they are guilty of having failed to listen to their child's concerns when they could have done something meaningful about it?
Yes, I agree. Some parents are being emotionally blackmailed by false information about threats of suicide by gender dysphoric children into thinking that if they make any attempt to help their kid accept their anatomic sex, that they are putting their child at risk of suicide.
Okay.
And it's just pure manipulation
Sean,
by trans activists.
It's manipulation and it's emotionally blackmailing.
I have to ask, who is manipulating? Where is this coming from? I mean, I certainly, you know, I'm transgender myself. I work with a lot of transgender children in the work that I do. No one's parents were looking for this or expected it. It was something new for them too. Most parents of transgender children have had to go through a long process. It's not like your GP pushes it. It's not, you know, it's quite difficult, in fact, to access healthcare in this country. Schools aren't very aware of it. It's this idea that there is some kind of pressure or some trans mob that walks into a home and says, your child's playing with dolls, it's time for surgery. Like, that doesn't happen. It is the child themselves that drives it, and people realise because they want to rescue a
We've run
child
out
in
of time.
distress.
A last word to you, Ray. Do you think it's just
getting the message?
a last word to you, Ray?
Yes?
Do you think it's
sorry.
just because, essentially, this is a very new science, people haven't caught up with where transgender issues are, even those who work within it? Briefly.
I think the problem is that the media coverage, and I'm not talking about the BBC here, but media coverage has been so overwhelmingly one-sided in terms of cheerleading for gender transition and has not covered other aspects of the question. Even.
OK, thank you both very much indeed. Thank you. We just lost right at the end there.